As we begin the course, I think it'll be helpful to get a historical overview of assessment and evaluation. So let's take a look at some of the important points about this in depth. Our textbook begins by looking at why we assess young children, and we've already reviewed that in the previous lecture. However, there's one additional purpose given here, and that is for accountability, which you'll see at the bottom of this diagram. Accountability in education refers to holding individual students, teachers, programs, and schools accountable for student achievement. And while this can be an important purpose for evaluation, there are inherently risks involved too. For example, the state or program evaluations can be conducted and they might put funding at risk. And certain standardized tests are considered high stakes when a poor score may cause a child to be held back a grade or go to summer school. Child assessments can also be used to hold teachers accountable for what children are learning, and they may place teachers' jobs in jeopardy. But let's take a look at some of the historical people that have been important in the realm of assessment. And we're going to go back as far as the 1700s and talk about some of the gentlemen there that started looking at young children and observing them and trying to understand how they grow, develop, and learn. The first here is Rousseau, and Rousseau concluded from his study of children that children's nature is essentially good and should be allowed to just unfold. And in his book, Emile, he tells the child actually tells the story of how he should be treated. And so Rousseau felt that we didn't need to interfere too much with the child's development, that it would just unfold naturally. Then Locke concluded that the child was born a blank slate, the tabula rasa, and he was concerned more about proper education of young children because he didn't feel that development just unfolded, but that the environment that the child grew up in was a very important aspect of growth and learning. And then Pestalozzi, who was a pioneer in the education of young children, he based a lot of his understanding of children on the observation of his own school. And he was known for opening schools for orphans back in the 1700s. And then Froebel, who is known as the father of kindergarten and studied under Pestalozzi, based his schools on the unique needs and capabilities of young children based on observation and what the professionals were beginning to learn about young children in the 1700s. So we can see that the 1700s were a very important beginning of the assessment and studying young children. And then during that time, during the 1800s, a lot of different schools and programs were developed for young children. But another big important jump in our understanding of children came in the 1900s with the child study movement. The child study movement began in the early 1900s with G. Stanley Hall. And the persons involved in this movement taught that observation and other strategies were important ways to assess children, rather than testing them, but to put them in a natural environment and observe them. G. Stanley Hall developed methods of studying children through observation, and one of his students happened to be John Dewey, who advocated for educational reform based on observation of children. Charles Darwin, who's probably best known for his theory of evolution, believed that by studying the development of the infant, one could get a glimpse of the development of the human species over time. And then Lawrence Frank, who I couldn't find a photo of, advocated that early investments of healthy social interactions at the nursery school level could prevent future interpersonal problems. And he developed a vision for systematic research of children's developmental growth. So you can see now here in the early 1900s, we're just getting a huge push of trying to understand young children through assessment and observation. And then another hallmark of the 1900s was the creation of standardized testing, which faces controversy today, as we will discover later in the course. The SAT was developed for college applications to support a fair comparison of students who were seeking admissions to universities. At first, tests were developed informally and just shared with other professionals. But then as the demand for tests grew, so did companies that specialized in testing development and production. Alfred Binet, who I'm sure you've heard of, was a French psychologist, and he developed the intelligence scale, which was then, he worked with Stanford University in the United States and created a revision of that test, and it was called the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, and it was completed by Lewis Terman at Stanford University. But the development and profit from creating tests has really boomed in the last 4 years. There are many companies now who are devoted to developing and marketing these tests. Many are good and useful, especially for helping to identify areas where a child might be struggling. And those are usually primarily diagnostic tests and screening tests for young children. As children were observed and began to be understood better through those observations, programs were developed for them. And in 1965, Lyndon Johnson established the War on Poverty, and many programs came out of this initiative, but the only one that remains today is Head Start, which is a program for preschool children who are in poverty. In 1965, a mandate was established that all Head Start programs funded by the federal government had to be evaluated for effectiveness, because in the beginning they were running a lot of different types of programs. Some were very academic structured, but others were very social, emotionally structured. So as a result, new measurement and evaluation instruments for preschools were designed. And these evaluated different program models for their effectiveness and for children understanding the progress that children were making. And this led to the improvement of measurement strategies and tests that were used to evaluate programs. And in this picture, you can see a picture of Lady Bird Johnson reading to some Head Start children in 1966. As a direct offshoot of the civil rights movement, in the 1960s and 70s, people began to advocate for children and adults with disabilities. Public Law 94-142 guaranteed all children the right to appropriate education in a free public school, and that placement would be in the least restrictive environment. This was known as mainstreaming, but now it's called inclusion. A team of teachers and parents and specialists were to identify and place students with disabilities. And a vast array of techniques and instruments were required to do that identification with children with disabilities and determine how to best educate them. These are typically performed by professionals who are trained to administer psychological tests, such as psychologists or speech pathologists, and they're primarily known as diagnostic tools of assessment. Public Law 99-457 was passed in 1986 and mandated that states prove they are meeting the needs of all children with disabilities, including children ages 3 to 5 and birth to 2 years. Therefore, early childhood educators and specialists had to be knowledgeable in measurement and evaluation strategies for young children, for screenings and identification and placement. Since the 1980s, there have been many laws and regulations passed by the federal government that has changed the way evaluation is used in the United States. Public Law 101-576 states that all early childhood programs must be prepared to serve children with special needs, that facilities and accommodations to the program must meet the needs of children with disabilities, At this time, mainstreaming became known more as inclusion, with the goal of all young children learning together and the individual needs of all children being met in the regular classroom whenever possible. That is, the least restricted environment. In 1997, the Reauthorization Education for All Children Act noted that special education students must participate in state testing. However, there weren't any real accountability strands for that, so a lot of times it didn't happen. So then in 2001, when the No Child Left Behind Act was passed, it stated that states must include 95% of children with disabilities in the new required testing, but that they could have accommodations and adaptations. And then in 2004, it was required for states to administer tests and monitor yearly progress. And this was also where we were mandated to have annual report cards on school performance and annual standard-based assessments in reading and math. So mandates for increased testing that is standard-based continues in spite of concerns of its relevancy, especially for young children, but it's probably going to be here for a while longer. Earlier, we talked about accountability as a purpose of assessment. And accountability is one of the major factors in education today. In 2003, Head Start programs were mandated to test all children with a standardized test known as the National Reporting System. Children were shown pictures in a binder, and they were asked to point to identify an object. And they were also tested on letter and number recognition. There were many problems with the National Reporting System, and it was discontinued after a few years. And when I worked at Head Start, I conducted many of these tests. And what I found was that children often refused to complete the test, and some of the pictures were difficult to determine what they represented. So there was a real concern about the validity of this test. And we'll talk more about validity and reliability later in the course. There are many concerns about testing young children, testing children with cultural and language differences, and testing children with disabilities. And we're going to cover each of these in depth during the course as well. National organizations have written position statements that address these concerns, and we're going to take time to read and analyze those position statements.